Started. Hello, friends. This is office hour number 2, week 1. And we had a question just on arrow functions. We are going to talk about this today in class. But here are 2 different types of functions. Now, we're going to talk about the differences, but here is what we call a function expression, or sometimes it's also known as an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name necessarily. We have to assign it to a variable. In this way, it's called say hello. And so normally with a normal function declaration, you would just use the word function, and then you would have your function name, right? And then after the function name, you would have, and I'll just pull up, this is what we're going over today in class. But normally you would have it something like this, right? Let me get this part. That you've got a function, you got the function name, you have this parenthesis in case there's any arguments or parameters that are being passed through. Then you have this curly bracket. And then after the curly bracket, or in between the curly bracket, is everything that is associated with that function, right? So anytime, in this case, foo is called, right? It's going to go in there and it's going to grab this information and it's going to do whatever it says. In this case, we're just console logging, but that is all that's happening. This is what we call a function declaration because we are declaring there's a function. Its name is foo. And then we've got these, if there were parameters, we would pass them in. Here is a little bit different. It's what we call a function expression. Now, again, this is also known as an anonymous function because, as you can see, this function here doesn't have necessarily a name. But in order for us to call it, we do have to set it to a variable. Let's say that this function returned something like return 1 + 1. If it did that, in order for us, well, first off, I got to spell correctly. There she is. In order for us to do this, if I wanted to get the value that this is returned, I'm going to have to set this, or I'm going to have to call this variable, right? And then I can grab that initial value, right? So here's the name associated in the same way that here is this name right here. And so what this is doing is this is a functional expression, right? And this was from ES6 is where it started utilizing arrow functions, which you can sort of think of them as synonymously. There's quite a few under the hood things that really work with React that I transparently think is a little bit more advanced for where we're at currently. Maybe down the line, we can talk about it, really handling this, the keyword of this. If you guys remember from Web Fundamentals, or if you just came from Web Fundamentals, this is associated with if you're handling like a person and you want that person's name and you want to change it, this is a key word there. And the way that arrow functions handle the word this comparative to a normal function declaration is different and actually is preferable in React because it will not mess up our code. And because of how React operates, if we do a function declaration, especially with what we call we're going to learn all about this stuff. So if I'm saying words that you don't know, I promise you we're going to get here. We're going to have something called an event handler that is going to really, anytime we click on a button that we're changing an event and something's happening in React, arrow functions allow us a lot more flexibility and allow us to really target specifically what we need, and it doesn't mess up our code like a normal function declaration. Really, the difference between these two is that one uses the arrow, sometimes called a fat arrow, but really just arrow function. And the other one is an anonymous function that just has this name. They both take in name. And there is, again, we're going to talk about some in-depth stuff that's different. But if you actually technically, this would be incorrect code, or it's not incorrect, but it's not fully using the power. If you're just bringing in one parameter, you actually don't need the parenthesis here. I could just say name. But what this is doing is we have this function called say hello. It takes in a name. And then what this is doing is what we call a string interpolation, or like a string literal. And what this does is these backticks, right? This is the key right above your tab on the left side. So it's just, there's a tilde and then there's the backtick, right? And so what this does is this allows us to inject some value in that we have saved, whether it's a variable, or in our case, it's going to be state, which is sort of, you can think about a variable that allows us to inject that value. So if somebody says, okay, my name is Will, I can say, hello, Will, right? Because it's injecting whatever value we have whenever we call our function. Oh yeah, so this is the correct way. Sorry, I just hadn't gone down. See, we don't have the parenthesis around here. And if it is just doing one thing, then we actually don't have to have these curly brackets. Kind of a simplicity thing. It's really where arrow functions have their power. But what this is doing, if we ever do want to do that, if we want to inject some sort of value into our string, the way we do it is we do these backticks, but then we also have to do this $sign and then a curly bracket around everything that we want to do. And if I had multiple of these, I would have to have, hello, maybe it was first name, comma, last name, right? And let's say that here you would have the comma last name, because if we have more than one parameter, we're going to have to do the parenthesis here. I would have to say hello, $sign, curly bracket, first name, space, $sign, curly bracket, last name. So this is just allowing us to grab a piece of information, whether that is, again, coming from this parameter, or if we have it attainable through other things, like we'll use state.
Okay, so the variable above is the same thing as the const below, but the only difference is the syntax changes for the console.log. And when you're using the fat arrow for the ES6.
Yeah, so these are doing the exact same thing. The difference is that with ES6, instead of having to declare that this is a function, you use the fat arrow and it knows that this is a function.
Okay.
And then secondly, if you just have a parameter, just one parameter. So there's a question in chat, where's name coming from? This would be whenever we call our function. So if we were to say something like say hello, now I'll just come down here. If I had something like, let's just take that code. I had this. Then I would say something like, say hello, Will. Or world, I guess, makes a little bit more sense because we're developers overall. So then when I run this, I'm going to get hello world. Now, remembering that this world is just our argument that we're passing in. And so with an arrow function, this is our parameter, right? So this is what my function's taking in. This, I'm going to make sure that you guys know this, could be unicorn, right? It's still going to run the same way. All we're doing is we are saying whatever value that this function's taking in this case, this is the string of world. When I want to refer to this, I'm going to refer to it as unicorn. So anywhere within my function, I can refer to unicorn, and it's whatever value is being passed through. So name is not in our HTML file. It's just the name that we gave our parameter that our function takes in. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yeah, that helps drastically. I guess I was just really stuck on the syntax of the console.log, and I wasn't understanding what is that called? A backtick. I wasn't understanding why there was a $sign and a backtick, and we're not using the same stuff I was using in HTML. So
yeah. So it is different. We talked about it very, very, very slightly yesterday, just when we were talking about strings, about how somebody asked a question about what if we had a quote and what that does. And what this does is it's just allowing us to basically, instead of having to do like string concatenation, right? So instead of having to do something like this, where I say, and this is part of ES6, instead of having to say like this, unicorn, and then part of the issue that you're going to see is if I do this and I run it, oh, look, there's no space. So then I'm like, oh, dang it. Okay, I got to come in here. Now I either have to do like plus, and then I have to do a space and then another plus, and then it works the way that I would think it would, or we just do the backtick. I'll just do this, or we just do the backtick, and then now it allows me to inject that value straight into my statement. And it doesn't even have to be a console log. It's not a console log specific thing. This backtick can be used anytime you're dealing with a string. So even if we had like a p tag or something, and we had some access to some value, I could just do that.
Okay, beans, awesome. Looking forward to seeing more tonight.
Yeah,
that's my only question. I got really stuck.
Perfect. No, you're good. We're going to talk about that all today. I haven't talked about it, arrow functions, but we're going to talk about it I mean, you guys kind of got a little bit of a glimpse of what we're going to talk about. We'll talk a little bit more in depth on that, but yeah, that's kind of the difference between all of these guys and what this does. There's some other things that arrow functions do. As you can see, you don't have to have a curly bracket because it implies a return, and you don't have to say return if you just have one statement because it's an implicit return. There's other ways you can do it if you want to have multiple statements or doing whatever. So we'll talk about that today too. So great question though. Anybody else have a question on that specifically? So somebody asked, is the say hello world, just want to clarify this, is this similar to console log? No, this is our function call, right? So in the same way that if I just had some sort of function, if I said function foo, and then I wanted to call that function, right? A function's great. It's a piece of code that I can store some information or reuse it. But I have to call it, right? Because whenever our code is reading it, it doesn't automatically read it. That's kind of the power of the function. You can have a lot of functionality that doesn't slow down your code, but you have to call your function. And so what this is doing is say hello. If I didn't have this, I have access to this function, but I never call it, right? So it's never going to say hello world. Here is my function call. And the way I do my function call is I just say the name or whatever I named this function. And then I pass in the parameter that it's expecting. It's just expecting one parameter. So I just have to pass in a parameter, right? And I decided to name that unicorn, but on the platform, we call this name because that makes a little bit more sense. And so now whenever I call this function, now name refers to whatever I pass it in. Whenever I did that, if I were to do something like this, it's gonna be an issue, right? Because this is only, and it already says this, it says it expects one argument, but two were provided. Here's my argument, and then my second argument, but my function only expects one. So it doesn't allow for that. And on the inverse as well, if I had something like this, if I had this, I'm still going to have an issue because I'm supposed to have two values. In this case, you're supposed to do this, right? Well, it's expecting for this function to work correctly. It's expecting two values, but only have one. So this isn't, let's see. This should give us an error. Undefined. Oh, so it looks like it automatically, and this is another type that we did here, is because I haven't set age to anything, it is undefined. So it just says, I don't know what age is. So then in there, you could have a check to make sure, like if age is not empty year, or you could set it to a default value. So you could set 18. So that way, if the value wasn't passed in, it automatically would do that. But if I were to say something like 25, then it'll automatically take in that value. Great questions. So somebody said, and this is a normal thing, is it weird to me that it's a const and you can change things in it, but other than that, it's all good. Yeah. So the power of this, there's sort of two things, right? Again, we're going to talk about this in ES5 and ES6. Up at the top here, we're talking about let and const. So if you guys are sort of confused, that's okay. Const is going to be, you can't change it after a declaration, right? And so if I were to say something like say hello equals after this, that's going to be a big no-no, right? It's immutable that way. But it allow, like I can still do it. I can still say const. And even if within a function, every time it goes, I'm redeclaring this const, that's okay. But if I were to try to change it after declaration, that's an issue. And we'll talk about like scope as well in class when we're talking about it, because that's really where people get confused. Like, oh, I thought const couldn't be changed. Why are we putting it as a const versus a let? We'll talk about that in class as well. Somebody asked, I thought if you declare the variable as this, so this is what we call a default value. So this is not a variable. This is my parameter. And what this is basically saying is, hey, if nothing's passed through, then I want you to default to 18 years old. But if something is passed through, take on and inherit that specific value. So because I passed in this value of 25, it ignores my default and it sets age to 25. Now, if I didn't have this, if I just had it like this, oops, then by default, I didn't pass in anything. So it says, oh, nothing was passed in an age. Therefore, I'm just going to default this to 18. Yeah, exactly. Great job, Jennifer. If nothing's passed through, then it's going to go to the default value. If something is passed through, then it inherits that value. Somebody asked, am I going to cover NPM installation? So I'm not going to cover NPM installation. No, I'm not covering that. So if there's some issues, then we can chat about that as well. But cool. Any other questions on this? If not, I'm going to go to my terminal. Sort of, I want to walk. Go ahead.
Like say hello is like the name of the function, right? It's not a variable.
So it is the name of the function. Yeah.
It's not like, it's not a variable. It's we're declaring a variable there.
Yeah, so we are. So this is an arrow. This is our arrow function, right? And it's called an expression, basically, to where we don't have, because this is called an anonymous function and this is called an arrow function. In order for us to refer back to them, we do set it as a value here. So we do say constant, we give it a name here. But by doing the arrow function, it allows us to do different things like not putting a parenthesis if there's only one parameter, not having to have a curly bracket. And then also by doing an arrow function, there's other things that are happening that are beyond the scope of, especially right now and where we're at, like especially handling different properties in the background that allows us a lot more flexibility when it comes to React.
Oh, okay.
But again, we're talking about arrow functions today. Somebody asked, instead of world, could you use a database table reference? So it depends on what your function's doing, right? If you needed to do something with your database table and you needed that name and then it was going to call some sort of DB with that, then sure, you can. World is just a parameter, or it's an argument we're passing through. It's fully dependent upon what your function is doing. So if your function's set up to take that in and do something with it, then sure, you could absolutely do that. Just a simple value. Great questions, guys. Cool. Okay, well, I want to go over some terminal basics because I think that they're really important. I think they're really, really, really important for you to know. I think that there are tools in order for you to be able to navigate and to use your terminal. And then when you're dealing with Git and GitHub, then I want you to be able to use this and not rely on GUIs, which is a graphical user interface, or right, or buttons or things within VS Code that just like you click a button and then you're good to go. But if you get a new computer and you don't know how to do it, and there's like a whole bunch of issues there. So I usually like, especially in this class today, before we do intro to React, I like to do a little bit of a terminal sort of walkthrough or command prompt or PowerShell or whatever you're using. One thing I do want to note is I am on a Mac computer. So I'm using, if you're using Bash, then it works perfect if you're on a Windows, but if not, they might be a little bit different. I'll try to, if I know them. Transparently, I don't work off of Windows, so there might be something that I don't specifically know, but if somebody does know it in the chat, feel free to put it. Or you can always Google, what is LS in Windows, and it'll say like, oh, it's dir, whatever. So cool. Well, this is our terminal. Now, you might have a couple of different options, again, depending on what you are using. If you're on a Mac, then you're using our terminal, and this is our ZSH. That's just kind of default. On Windows, you can have a couple different options. You can have a Bash Or you can get like git bash is one of them. You can use PowerShell, you can use command prompt. They all have different sort of, depending on the language that you're writing in, they have different processes or which ones are a little bit better. There's a whole bunch of, you can kind of get in the weeds on terminals and different things you can do. I just use a basic one. I don't need some of that advanced stuff, and or a lot of it's just visualization. So like if you want a different color, or if you want images, I don't care about that. So I just want to be able to navigate. So right now I just opened this up and this is telling me where I am at. I can do PWD and this is my present working directory. So what that means is on my computer in here in my Finder, right? I've got all these different things. I have desktop and downloads and all this stuff, but at a very, very high level, I'm just at users, and in my users, I have a profile named William Calhoun, which is obviously me. And that is all that I'm at. That's where I'm at. So I'm at a high level. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to navigate instead of having to go here and then click desktop and then click on, whatever. I'm going to be able to navigate just through this. So if I wanted to see what I wanted to use, or sorry, what I have available to me, because I can't just skip ahead, right? I know that I've got a folder that's called week 2 in Coding Dojo, but I can't just put that, right? I have to go step by step by step in the same way that I have to click this, and then I click this, and then I click this, and then I click something else, and I keep clicking, right? I have to do the same thing within my terminal. So if I want to see what I have availability to, or what I have available to me, what I can do is I can say ls, and this is on Mac, it's dir if you're on Windows. And this is going to give me everything I have access to, right? I've got all these different things. For some reason, I have node modules here. I'm going to say rm, rf. No, I shouldn't have node modules here. So I'm going to go ahead and delete those. Cool. rm space dash rf. This is removing a folder in my folder of node modules. So now if I say ls, now you see that it's no longer there. Cool. But I have access to a whole bunch of stuff, but I know that my folder I want is within my desktop. So now I need to change my directory and go into my desktop. So the way I can do that is I say cd, and then I can type desktop, or I can type desk, or I can even say de, and I press tab and it automatically goes. Now, why did that work? Because what it'll do is it'll look and say, is there anything it'll look and say, you've added de. Is that unique, right? If I just have D, you can see that I've got desktop, documents, and downloads. So if I do this, it's going to say, well, which one did you mean? Did you mean desktop? Did you mean documents? Did you mean downloads? But the minute I do DE, right, neither of these have an E after. So it just infers I mean to go to my desktop. Once I press enter, you can now see that I'm at my desktop, right? So if I say ls, now I got a whole bunch of other things. But I have a whole bunch of other things within my desk. I have lots of screenshots. Love that. But I have a whole bunch of other stuff. And I want to go to this Coding Dojo. I'm going to do something called clear. And what clear is going to do is it's going to kind of take it to the top. I can also scroll up and it'll still work. But it kind of gives me a clear working space. Cool. But I'm still on my desktop. So now I need to cd into Coding Dojo. Now, because I have spaces, if I were to type it out, this is how I would have to type it to ignore this space, right? Remember yesterday we talked about this slash here that was whenever we were dealing with strings. And let's say I had a quote within my string. This was my escape character to ignore this, right? And so I could keep doing this. I could say cd to Coding Dojo, enter, then go to instruction, enter, and then go to April 23 MERN, enter. Or I could actually keep going. If I know what I'm looking for, I can actually just keep adding my path. And this is what we call our path, right? Where our folder is or our file is. So I can say something like April MERN, press enter. And now instead of having to do cd Coding Dojo, cd instruction cd, cd April MERN, I can just do it all in one. And it gets me to April MERN. Now I type ls. Cool. Now it says week 1. That's what we're in. I can CD into week 1. Let's type LS. And I see that I've got lecture 1, sorry, and lecture 2. Great. Now, let's say I went, Christian, you're funny. Let's say that I went to the wrong one. Let's say I went into CD lecture 1 and I'm like, oops, I mean lecture 2. Well, in order for me to navigate backwards, I still change directory, but I do space and then ... Now what that space ... will do is take me back to week 1, and then I can navigate to the correct spot. And the same way that we can navigate into multiple folders or directories is really the correct terminology. I can navigate out of multiple directories by doing something like CD space ... slash ... slash ... And now you see I'm all the way back to Coding Dojo. I skipped April MERN, I skipped instruction CD, and now I'm already back, right? Because this took me back to April, back to instruction, and then now I'm here at Coding Dojo. Again, if you guys are using a Windows, it might be a little bit different. So like this LS is going to be a dir, but this is a way that we can navigate to and fro within our terminal, which is going to be really important when we are dealing with GitHub, because I'm going to show you guys in a second how we're going to go ahead and create something within GitHub and push it through. Are there any questions on what I've talked about now? Tabitha, what kind of computer do you have? Okay, so you have a Windows. So one thing that is important is if you are trying to go to downloads, but you do a capital D, it's going to be specific to that. So you got to make sure that the naming convention is correct. That's also why I like to use the tab. So if it's a capital D for downloads and you do lowercase d, sometimes it remembers it, sometimes it doesn't. I know that on some Windows, I think if you did like a lowercase desktop, it would go, but that might be part of the issue. Yeah, I would say that if you've got I've never used Commander, but somebody in here is saying that they've had a lot of issues with Commander and they would just use bash. You could use like command prompt. I don't know if that is the Commander. Sorry, I'm not super Windows literate. And then I think the other one's PowerShell is like another one that I know that Windows users use. Cool. Somebody asked about what am I using here? This is Stage Manager. It's just built in, actually. It's pretty dope. You just click it right here. Stage Manager, and then it now takes like everything. I just found it out like literally 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it's changed my life. So cool. Yeah, I would say PowerShell is usually pretty basic, or command prompt. I don't know, Commander, Git Bash. So Git Bash will allow you to use like what I'm doing, LS, and certain things you can do with Git Bash. It's like Unix commands compared to Windows. You can use the terminal in your VS Code as well. Thanks, Jared. Okay, so that's us navigating. If I wanted to go all the way back, I could do CD space and then the tilde. And that'll take me all the way back to where if I do PWD, you see I'm back to William Calhoun. So CD space tilde takes you all the way back. So if you're dealing with that, then there might be something different. Or if you, then you can just do this and it gets you all the way back. Cool. Looks like you guys are figuring it out. Thanks everybody in the chat for helping out there. Now, there's 2 things I want to talk about. First off, we are going to save some time here, about 10 minutes for about GitHub. But for 5 minutes, I want to talk about a new sort of, not a new thing, but something that can really, and this is a little bit more of an advanced topic. So if you are confused by this, please don't be, we can meet together. You can talk about an office hour. I can help you get this set up. But here's just a tool that I use literally every day to help me, and it's creating shortcuts. Now, I don't exactly know what it is in Windows. I know that you can make a bash RC file, and then in Mac, you do a ZSH RC file. And I think you just do open /tilde.zshrc. But here, we'll see what it is. But what it is a file that lives on your computer that allows you to create shortcuts. So yeah, so it's open /ZSHRC. And I believe that if you don't have this file, it'll create one. So this is just a ZSHRC file. And what this does, it allows me to create shortcuts, and it allows me to create my own sort of commands. Before I show you this, I do want to show one more thing, just because I realized that there's one more thing I want to show you. We've seen how to CD, but if I do this and I CD into week 1, let's say that I wanted to create a new folder for tomorrow, right? I wanted to create my lecture 3 folder. So we're just going to go ahead and get that sort of set up today. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to mkdir. This is make a directory, mkdir. And then I'm going to give it the name that I want my directory to be. So in this case, it'll be, I'm following how I normally have them. It is lecture 3. One thing I would encourage is sort of get used to not having spaces or special characters in your folder names. Go to camel case. I promise you it'll make your life a lot easier. Some files don't like being run if you have a space in between, and then you'll have to find that. And it's just a big pain. So I would really encourage you guys to get used to just using folder names, especially like this, or else you're going to have to deal with other things too. So cool. So we ran mkdir. We named it lecture 3. We did not get an error, so that is good. So if I say ls and I now want to look at where I'm at, you see that I've got this lecture 3. Cool. Well, I can CD into lecture 3. And then if I ls, it's empty, right? I don't have anything in there. All I have is a folder. Every class, I'm going to have a class overview markdown file. So what I can do is I can create a new one. The way I create a new one is this keyword of touch. And so touch is a keyword that allows me to create a file. And then I say the name of my file, dot, and then whatever the file type is. So I'm going to say class overview dot md. Oops, dot md. Now, if I do ls, you see that I've got this file created. I've got this file created here, which is awesome. Cool. But yep, so I can do that. I can create another directory within here by saying mkdir. But something I noticed was I kept saying mkdir, my folder name, and then I would navigate straight into that. And that kind of bugged me. I was like, man, this sucks. And I learned about these things called aliases. So going back to this ZSHRC, right? You can create these aliases, which you can sort of think about them as variables, but they're just shortcuts within your terminal. So in this case, when I say the word edit, this is the actual command it's running. It's going to open, it's got my tilde.zshrc, and that opened up this file. Opened up this file. I have another one. I don't know if you caught it, that I have MERN. And what that does is it just, whenever I open up a new terminal, I just type MERN and it CDs into my desktop, into Coding Dojo, into instruction, into April MERN. So instead of me having to do all of that, it just does it for me. So it's a way that I could do a shortcut. So just to show you, I'll do my CD tilde, right? That gets me back to the main one. And then I'm going to say, MERN, and it gets me all the way to April MERN. Perfect. Thank you, Jared, for posting a cheat sheet. Cool. Now, again, I can create these, and it just is great for navigating. Like if you're always having to do the same thing over and over, like if you guys took Python and you had to create an environment that you had to install Flask and PyMySQL and Flask bcrypt, I just did an F test, and then it just basically created that environment for me, and I didn't have to do anything. And so I can do a whole bunch of stuff through that. Like I had, when I taught data science, I had this environment variable that I used to activate. And instead of having to do all that, I just had to say DSENV, which is awesome. Now, the big thing for me is that it also allows you to create functions. And again, if this is confusing you, then no worries. This is not at all mandatory. This is just a tip or trick that I have, just a tip on things that make my life a lot easier. And so what you do with this is, and for all my Windows peoples, I am so sorry. I will work on getting you all of this translated over. I do understand how this can be confusing. So I will work on that this week to try to get that for you. I know Jared's doing something, but I'll try to get this all over for you, and everything I have, I'll try to make that. So sorry about that. But going back to this, for those that are following along, I can create a function and I call it MKCD, and it is just a function. And what this does is it first makes a directory and then it CDs into it. Now you might be wondering, what the heck is this number or $1? Well, this $1 just refers to the argument that I pass it. So if I pass it multiple arguments in the same way we have a function, the first argument that I pass is going to be referred to as $1. The second one is going to be referred to as $2 if I wanted to. For an example, in Django, we used to teach Django, but you would have to you'd have to use Django admin, start project, then you'd put your project name. You'd have to then CD into it. You'd have to create a git ignore file. You'd have to CD into that again. You'd create a secrets py file. You'd CD back out. You'd run Python 3 manage py start app. And then the second name, so the second kind of file that you wanted to create, then you'd CD into that. You'd have to touch and create this file. You'd CD back, and then you could, and then this is another shortcut that I'll show you here in a second. So you can see there's a lot of stuff. Instead of me having to do all that, I just had to type Django temp space, whatever I wanted this to be. So my first one, and then space my second one. So I'll show you what that means here in just a second. So here in April MERN, I got this week 1. So instead of me having to say mkdir week 2, enter, cd week 2, I just, because I created it, mkcd week 2. Ooh, almost messed it up. Week 2. And now what it does, because week 2 is my first value that I passed it, it goes and it runs mkdir for week 2. So it's making a directory called week 2, and then it's automatically CDing into that directory. So now you can see I didn't have to CD, it's just already there. Cool. So you can do a lot of stuff with this. When we get to React, instead of having to run npm start, create React app, and then run npm start, we can just automatically do this, which is really fun. So I actually have to do CD into. I'm just realizing this wouldn't have worked. So these are just functions. Again, this is all super not necessary. It's just if you guys like shortcuts, or if you like creating shortcuts or editing your own workflow, this is a way that you can totally do that. Again, for those Windows people, I will work on this, and I'll try to work on a file maybe that I put in Discord for you guys by the end of the week to kind of do some of this stuff, and maybe some of my own functions that might help you out. So I'll try to create something like that for you.
I just put one in there that's from columbia.edu, and that should be more than enough information for everybody. It looks like it has everything that Jared was giving us, and it's a cheat sheet that you can download from their website.
You're the best. Thank you so much, Tabitha. Yeah. So that's just a tool. Those are tools that I like to use, but really the main things are, can you CD into things? Can you look into what there is? Can you create a file? And can you make a folder? Those are, if you know how to do those 4 things, you're good to go. Now, I'm going to talk about this in class, but we're going to go ahead and make a GitHub repository. It won't take me that long. Yeah, we'll go ahead and do it. So I'm going to go to github.com. Here's my GitHub, right? So I'm going to walk through, I'm going to CD back here. I'm going to less. Cool. So let's say that I had this ACD test, and then I had touch index.html. Cool. So all I'm doing is I created a new folder called April GitHub. Within that, I have a folder called test. And then within that, I just have an index.html. I don't need it to be full. That's not the point of this. It's just to show you guys how we can do this in GitHub. So I'm going to clear this. So if I say ls, we see that I just have this file, right? But my project, I'm just going to call as this April GitHub example. Cool. So one thing to note is that Git and GitHub are different. Git is just a version control. It's a way that if you think about, like, if you guys now have used Google Docs or, like Microsoft Word Online, where maybe you've written something and you can see all the different versions. So every time you've edited something, you added a paragraph, you can always go back and view that. Back in the day when I was in college, you just had, final paper. Then you had final paper number 1. Okay, like final paper, right? You had all these multiple versions of all of this. Now, what we can do now is just have them all at one, and I can go back and forth with the different versions, right? Git is doing the exact same thing. Git is our way that we can do version control or manage our different versions. So that way, if we mess up our code, we can just always revert back to when we know that it worked, right? Last time we pushed it and it was working and we had it available. If I mess it up and something's totally wrong, I can always revert back. If you guys could mute, that'd be great. So Git in itself is our version control. So you'll need to have that. And that should be, you guys should have gone through that through Web Fundamentals. There's an entire section there. So if you don't have Git, make sure you follow that. GitHub is just a way that we can host or visualize or keep track of those, what we call repositories. And so anytime you're creating a new repository, it's like creating a new file within Git and saying, cool, I want you to keep track of all the different versions of this, right? And so GitHub is just one of many ways. AWS is code commit. There's GitLab. There's a ton of different versions. GitHub is probably the most popular, if not is the most popular, other than maybe AWS, because a lot of companies just host their code there. Because AWS is the largest cloud provider. But other than that, GitHub absolutely is the largest and something I would encourage you guys to use for sure. So we have this file here. Now, nothing's happened, right? We haven't done anything with it. We're not telling Git, I want you to make sure that you keep control or you keep track of all these different versions. So what I first need to do is I need to what we call initialize our repository. So I'm going to say git init. Now, this is really important. Before you do this, make sure you're at the correct level that you want, right? This is my project folder of April GitHub. If I accidentally did it in test, then I have to remove that and then go back into this. And it's sort of a little bit confusing. So make sure first, before you initialize, you are where you want to be. This is my entire project folder. Cool. Once I do this, we get initialized empty Git repository. So it's saying, cool, I'm keeping track of this. Now, my next thing I will do is if I say ls, cool, I have this folder test. We know it has an index.html. I am wanting to, you can sort of think about it as saving or adding to or kind of copy and pasting, but saying this is what I want to add to this repository. And the way I do this is git add. Now, after git add, I could either do a period, and that's going to be, I want you to add everything. It's usually what I do transparently. Or if you just had a specific file, so maybe you finished one portion of it, but another portion is being fixed. Maybe you just fix something on the HTML, but some other functionality that doesn't have to do with that HTML is still kind of getting fixed. You can just say, I want to git add index.html, right? In this case, I'm going to do a period, and that's going to get me everything. So if I say get status, I see that I just got this new file within my folder of tests, and it's called an index.html. Perfect. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to say git commit -m. This -m is saying, cool, I am committing this. I'm officially saving this, or sorry, what commit is saying is I'm officially saving this new information, this new file to my repository. -m is saying, and I want the following message. And so we say -m, and then we do 2 quotation marks, and we do something. Now, this is usually where you want to add in, what did you do? Did you fix some CSS? Did you, create new repository? Did you add in a new component? Something like that. So I'm going to say initialize new repo. Repo and repo is just short for repository. Cool. So we did not get any error. We changed our file. So on our local computer, everything is good to go. Now, in order for me to do GitHub, and there is a little section that you'll have to go through, right? And we don't quite have time for this now, but if we need to tomorrow, we can walk through. You're going to have to set up your credentials, right? And so if you've already been messing with GitHub, you know how to do this. And if you haven't, then we can go through your credentials setup tomorrow if that's what people need. But let's pretend that you've already done this. Well, next, what I need to do is I need to create a new repository, right? And so I'm going to go to the account that I want. So I have multiple accounts for multiple companies, right? And then I'm going to say, April GitHub test. All right. This is just my repository name. So when I'm looking at it, I'm going to be able to see, cool, this is good to go. I can decide to make it public or private. I'm going to make it private. You don't have to, you can make it public. Just that means anybody can view it and see your code. So if you are working on something, there's a lot of rules, but we'll talk about environment variables and API keys and all that way towards like week 5 and 6. But I'm going to make it private. You can add a README. That's not really important. What I want to get to is now I've already created this on my local repository, and now I need to connect it to GitHub, right? I need to connect it to my remote repository. So what is great about GitHub is if you are creating a new one, you can do this, right? And so if you had added a README, then you can echo that. But you can see we sort of did the same thing. We get init, get add, we get commit. Now we would do these guys. But since we've already created our repository, we've already run the get init, the get add, the get commit, we can push to an existing repository. So here, I just copy and paste, and I would encourage you to copy and paste because when you're setting up your remote, so basically it's just connecting the two. If you make an error, if you're just typing and you make an error, it can kind of become very confusing. So what I like to do is just copy and paste, get remote, perfect. I do get branch. And then it's going to be git push u origin main. Cool. So now we can see everything is good to go. It says that we are on track. We are on our main one. So now if I refresh, we can see my folder test. And within that, we have this index.html. So I haven't done anything with that yet, but I'm able to now visualize and see that. Lastly, if we were to do something, so I'm going to, we got like 1 minute. So then we're gonna have to boost it. There's also a shortcut called CODE space period. If you're on Windows, this is inherent and works for you because it's Microsoft or Visual Studio's code. If you are on Mac or some sort of Linux machine, you just do Command-Shift-P when you come here, and then you see this shell command, or type path, and this will come up, and you click it, and it is added in. So now anytime you're navigating, you say code space period, and then it'll automatically open up a VS Code at that exact spot that you're at. So here, if I were to tape, like, let's just do this, we save it. Now I've got new information, right? My repository has changed. So now all I have to do is I don't have to initialize anymore. It's already there. Git add space period. Git commit dash m added HTML. And see, it says that one file changed, 12 new insertions because we have 12 new lines of code. And then now all I have to say is git push. Cool. And if I go back to my code and I refresh, I see that I have this added HTML. If I click on this, now I have my updated code. That was a very fast walkthrough. I promise. We got to start class, but I promise I will continue to go through GitHub. And I will do another just sort of build out of GitHub and how that works. So if there is any confusion, I fully recognize that was very fast. And we just kind of covered a whole bunch. So I will make sure that I continue to teach you guys about GitHub because I think that it's a tool that you need to know, you need to be able to operate with, and you need to be able to use and post stuff on GitHub. And we're going to talk today just about a warning about GitHub and how that works. So with React. So real quickly, real fast. Are there any questions? Somebody asked, is there a downside to just using GitHub desktop? No, there's not a downside. That's fine. It does make it easier. I would encourage you just to be able to navigate on your terminal, because if you are going to do like the black belt, if you're doing any sort of code stuff, you're just terminal basics and knowledge is really important just to know in general. So, okay. I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording here and then we'll get started with class.